Yeah, we're back. We're live. This is an important show. It's Community Matters. And we're having Minara Mordecai, who's a graduate student at William S. Richardson School of Law. No, where? Tell me.
At the University of Hawaii, the College of Education.
College of Education. So we're talking about education. We're talking
Yes.
about law. We're talking about technology and community matters here. We're talking about emerging issues around student privacy. Very important. You know, you think the college campuses are maybe like when you went to school, you think the college campuses, it's all pristine and and thoughtful and safe. Maybe not. And privacy is one of the risks, one of the dangers, one of the threats for our students today in college and other levels of education. So, Minara, can you tell us what you've been studying and writing about in this area?
So I began looking at this through my dissertation. My original focus was on students with disabilities in K through 12 environment. So I started looking at how technology has been helping, and it's been really instrumental in improving learning possibilities for students with disabilities. For example, students who are diagnosed on autism spectrum disorder. But then as I dug deeper, I saw that the private companies that are providing these tools and resources, they're collecting inordinate amount of data and information about students, and there aren't enough guidelines or protections to assess what's happening to that information, right? They're collecting information about students' disabilities, their age, their parents, where they live even, and all of this is going into private sector, privately owned companies. So as I started looking more and more into that, I realized that there was a gap between what is happening on the ground with schools, specifically with K through 12 schools, because we're dealing with minors, and what is happening on the ground versus what is happening in law and policy. And the original law that protects student rights, FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, that was passed in 1974. So that still remains as the overall federal legislation that protects student rights when it comes to their records. It says that students have a right to review their records, their parents, if they're minors, have a right to review their records, and that information about students should not be released to outside agencies like Google without consent. Now, fast forward to what's going on now, we have a lot of vendors and private companies that are now in the schools that are helping with the learning opportunities. And there is definitely benefit to that. But the legislation hasn't been updated to assess what is happening with these digital collection of data.
Yeah, well, Congress is busy doing all kinds of, well, let me say, not doing all kinds of other legislation. So where would this fit on the priorities? I mean, if you handed them a really excellent and important and relevant and timely bill, what do you think would happen, Minara?
I know what happened. It actually happened in 2015. There was 8 separate bills that were introduced, and President Obama called it a priority for him. And then they all kind of died off. So what was happening instead is the states have picked up the tempo and have been passing laws that are state relevant. So you see that happen in California, in Virginia, in Connecticut, in Georgia, and they're becoming more and more restricting about how that data is shared. What we see emerging is the unintended consequences of this almost haphazard way of creating barriers. And the unintended consequences have detrimental impact on student learning opportunities.
So for example, give us an example, yes.
Yeah, definitely. So for example, if a state passes a law that says students may not be reported, any classroom environment may not be reported without parental consent and maybe additional approval by the board, something along those lines. Now, we know that a lot of students with disabilities are using video interactions with teachers, and that's been really helpful for them for learning. So now it's creating a barrier. So the teachers have an additional barrier in their communication with the students because they have to seek parental consent for every interaction with student who is on IEP plan. The other consequence has been for for example, there was a law that I think it was in Connecticut. So the issue has been with biometric data as well. There's some, Illinois has passed biometric data restrictions. That includes images and things like that. Again, that affects students with disabilities. Then video recordings are an important part of teacher training. So now if you can't record teachers who are in training without additional consent from parents, it limits how we create opportunities for teacher learning and teacher certification. So these are all unintended consequences that the states have gone back and addressed with amendments to their laws.
Well, is there a uniform bill out there? Is there an organization that will lobby all states to try to get it consistent? It seems to me that in such an area which is capable of so many different interpretations and approaches, education is different on every block, it seems like.
Yeah.
And if you do the new federalism and put it all on the states, you're going to get inconsistent results, and for that matter, inconsistent consequences. So how do we get this to be consistent, uniform around the country?
So the key is to look at it to be thoughtful about it, as opposed to creating or passing laws as a backlash. And I think this is what my interest lies in my research, is that you do recognize, and we do recognize, there is benefit to having technology introduced in the classroom. The services that like Google Classroom or Zoom has been able to provide to, especially during pandemic, as you know, there's no way a school district would be able to afford to create all of that from scratch. So we recognize that technology is valuable, and we can and should outsource some of it to private vendors. Now, passing guidelines that are preventative at the forefront to say, these are all the barriers that we've created on a national scale. So GDPR is a good example of that. It covers a broad area all of Europe, so that the burden is not on individual schools, states, or districts to control what is happening with student information. So I think the step one is to look at it nationally. And there are a number of organizations that advocate for it. Part two is to really understand what is driving this fear, right? There's a fear for privacy violations, and a lot of it stems from lack of transparency and lack of trust. And if we begin with these issues and we say, how can we make this information more transparent? How can we build trust with parents and students to understand what are their main concerns for privacy? And then the second, to be thoughtful about what are we doing right now with student data that is useful. So sharing student emails, for example, right? If I'm in a classroom with someone and I'm on a group project, I want to be able to access my classmates' emails so I can contact them for additional advice. And if we put very limited, very restrictive privacy laws that won't allow us for even to get access to our classmates' information, that has detrimental effects as well. And we've seen that happening as well too.
So you're looking at issues that cut both ways. One way is to be more private, or at least protective, and the other way is to be less private, to allow innovative educational systems to develop. And we should also appreciate that. Is there a state or federal organization that deals with this that you can speak of?
There is a federal unit as part of the Department of Education that provides tech assistance with understanding educational technology and the role that schools play in allowing educational technology access to student information. So they provide a number of guidances, which is great, but the burden still remains on the school. The way our laws are structured right now, the burden is on the schools and the districts to make sure that they're being protective of this information. Now, if you shift the burden to the companies that are providing this, you'll see that they'll have more incentive to make sure that they're keeping up with the laws and compliance.
Well, that's a problem going to the trust question you raised earlier. And it seems to me, if I'm a paranoid parent, and I think there must be a lot of paranoid parents in the country these days, paranoid because of Sandy Hook and the
Hmm.
like, and Florida and
Yeah.
the like, about having nefarious people know about my kid. Have maybe this information, personal information, is shared, and then I know about who's in the school, and I'm the kind of person who does bad things with information. That would be of concern if I was a parent.
Hmm.
Likewise, it's this general dichotomy I described to you before the show, explored in a movie called Code Bias. It's a very
Hmm.
interesting movie on Netflix. And one of the great distinctions is in China, you have information that goes to the government, and it results in a social score. And you can, get on some trains, but not others, and some planes, but not, and you don't get the same level of jobs or careers if your social score is down, but you know about it. You
Yeah.
know what goes into the algorithm.
Yeah.
The American system is you don't know, and it's
Hmm.
held by private industry, and they do not share. They're not transparent. So if I was an
Yeah.
American parent, I'd be concerned, especially if this social media company like Google, for example, got hold of my kid's information. I was not restrained by law or otherwise from revealing that or selling it. Then my kid would be exposed, and I would have no idea to whom it went and what they were doing with it.
Hmm.
So, can you
Yeah.
paint me the darkest, blackest picture you can and tell me what my paranoid parents should worry about?
I don't want to create more paranoia than there already is. I think during the pandemic, the fears and the paranoia was there, but at the end of the day, when parents got surveyed, they said, I'm willing to take that risk and I'm willing to set my fear aside for the sake of my children still continuing learning. Even though I know there's a camera pointing into my house right now, and I do feel like it's an invasion of privacy, and I do feel like I have a government watching my home without any kind of permission, because schools are requiring students to have cameras on, but they're willing to set aside these fears at the time of a crisis. Now, once the crisis has passed, the issues still remain. And I think the darkest scenario that I will try to paint, and I will try to subdue it by saying, if we have good policies in place, this darkest scenario never has to happen.
Hmm.
And actually, a good example of it has happened where a school issued laptops to all of their students. They took that laptop home, have been using it, and unknowingly to the parents or the students, the school was taking photos of what is happening front at the camera, the laptop's camera, periodically, every hour or so. It was just
That is
capturing
really,
images.
really objectionable.
Right. But what is interesting, this is where we get into like really interesting policy discussion. It was legal, but it wasn't ethical. So what we're seeing right now happening with student privacy issues is that just because something is legal, it doesn't mean it's ethical. And we have this gap that has emerged between the discomfort that's being caused to the parents and the legality of the action, right?
Yeah.
So it was school issued laptop. They were fully within their right to monitor whatever is happening with that hardware. And there was a lawsuit, but it never actually made it to final decision. It got settled out of court, so we still don't have a decision as to legality of what happened there. But there was an outrage by the parents because they didn't know. It's again this lack of transparency. Like, you should have told me that you have thousands of photos of my children sitting at home in front of their laptops, and it's being stored on the school server. And it wasn't malicious. They said they were using it as a set of um, guidelines, or they wanted to protect theft. So they built in this mechanism so that if the laptop is stolen, these periodic image capturing would show who's using the laptop if it was stolen. But of
But you
course, it
know,
had unintended consequences.
no, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it really is invasive. I mean, it takes
Yeah.
advantage of the COVID situation
Yeah.
and takes the inside of the house. I would be mighty offended. And I would say, gee whiz, that's just no less than peeping Tom.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
creepy. You
Yeah.
can't do that. And I guess the question is, okay, you say transparency. So they tell you, the school tells you that we're taking a
Yeah.
picture every minute, and we're looking at the inside of your house and the expression in your kid's face or whatever it might be. You know, Minara, would you consent to that? Because that's really the issue.
Yeah.
You have the opportunity to provide an informed consent. Would you
Exactly.
consent? Myself, I would not consent. Would you consent?
I would not. But I think what it would allow for the school to see is why people would be upset about it. If they had approached the parent, because I'm pretty sure the school didn't decide we want to snoop on and spy on people's homes. I'm sure when they decided to build that in, they actually had a legitimate purpose in mind, but they didn't really fully consider the consequences of it. So if they had approached parents with this information, they would have gotten a lot of very negative feedback and they would have rethought this model and considered a different
Yes,
mechanism, right? So
yes.
when you have that conversation, when you put things out in the open, it actually benefits everybody that you still have mechanisms of protection, but you do it better and thoughtfully, and you understand privacy from the perspective of the people who are being affected.
Yeah,
And
we're still working it out with COVID and having machines at home and teaching by remote. This
yeah,
is a new model. It's really in large part only a year old, and we have to work it out. It's a new model. But let me ask you about an old model. Let me ask you about kids' privacy,
mhm,
because the school will gain a lot of privacy, and schools are no better off than anyone else against hacking and ransomware and gosh, just anything, and or people even within the school taking advantage,
mhm,
accessing the server, whatnot.
yeah,
And so if that information gets into the, what do you call it, the backstream of American, commercialism, and it becomes part of the profile of that child or that student, it's problematic because again, in the US, they don't tell you. As a general rule, you don't know. And it's floating around there, somebody's making a buck selling it, or using it for their own commercial activities. That's an emerging issue, isn't it?
it is, and schools have caught up to that issues, and they have been trying to put in guard, guards and barriers so that when you have a contract with someone like with a company like Zoom, for example, the contract should stipulate this data, whatever data you collect about our students, still belongs to the school. That you're not an owner of that data. Why is that important? Well, let's say Zoom gets bought out by a company, a security company, let's say in Israel or another country that is follows a completely different set of laws. And that data, and we know like Facebook, they're all of their assets is just data, right? So that data becomes part of that company's valuation if you don't stipulate at the forefront that whatever you collect about our students is not yours to sell or transfer, it's still our data. You have to set that up at the beginning. And that's the burden that is now placed on the school to think of all of these possible scenarios that can go wrong and putting that into contract. And this is where I don't know if you know these emerging offices, data governance offices have been coming out in public agencies. So Hawaii DOE is actually, I think they're ahead of the game. They have a data governance office. And I think of them, and most people don't know that, but they are they're the first barrier, they're the insurance. They set up these preventative measures to make sure that the data is collected accurately, it's guarded safely, and when it is shared, it's shared appropriately and safely. So you think of that as if you set that up from the beginning, it minimizes whatever damage that can happen later on from a breach.
But looking at it from a point of view of a lawyer entering into that contract or a
Mhm.
school managing the contract, there's an enforcement problem. So you're talking about a very smart company with some very smart wise guy programmers, who say to themselves, there's two profit centers here, One is on the back end. So we're not going to say anything. We know we're not supposed to, but we're going to sell this data on these kids, these students, through the Internet Research Agency in Moscow, or to some hacking organization
Yeah.
in Albania, or for that matter, to the likes of Cambridge Analytica. And they will open a file and keep track of these students, not just this semester or next, but for life. And it will feed into this global accumulation about all of us. And they will have that much more information to make their predictive analyses about what we might do, our vulnerabilities, our health, and on, and be able to send us custom tailored email or other messages on
Mhm.
social media that will have a special effect on us because they know us so well. And that could be worth a lot of money. And over time, if these companies are big and lawless and they sell it, notwithstanding an agreement to the contrary, here's my question, Minara. How do we know? How do we find out? How do we monitor this? I suggest to you there needs to be another subordinate industry of companies that will monitor the first level of companies to make very sure that they're following the rules.
Yeah.
Don't you agree?
Well, I will give you an example that happened recently that really desensitized this kind of selling of information. YouTube, well, its parent company, Google, got slapped with a $170 million fine for tracking kids and what they were watching on YouTube. As a result of that, I mean, $170 million is not a lot of money for Google, but they did have to make changes. And they did make changes in addition to what was required to them. So you can create incentives for companies to do the right thing. And from my personal experience, from my research, companies do want to do the right thing, but if you don't create guidelines, they won't necessarily, they will do what's profitable and what is legal. They're not necessarily going to do what is ethical, but they will do what's legal. So if you set it up as a legal parameter, that's a whole different issue. So now Google is limiting how they're tracking kids watching YouTube online. Now, that law that they violated is COPPA, it's a Children Online Privacy Act, and it applies to all kids under the age of 13. And that's regulated by the Federal Trade Commission. So they can go directly after the company, directly after the vendor. When we're talking about student records, that's governed by the US Department of Education. And they're not looking at the vendors, right? They're said the vendors can do whatever they want to do. We're looking at the school and we're holding the school liable for any violation.
Is that effective? Is that effective? Does that work?
The schools also try to do the right thing. But here's the thing, there is no private right of action under FERPA. So what does that mean? Parents cannot sue the school for any violation of FERPA. What they can do is file a complaint. The Department of Education will investigate it and they will issue a findings and the school will make a correction. But unlike with, let's say, Title IX, where you can do a lawsuit directly against the school, FERPA doesn't allow for private action. So I think it makes it less effective. But at the end of the day, I still think most entities, schools and tech providers want to do the right thing. But we do have to provide the guidelines for it.
Mm-hmm.
And shifting the burdens from already overburdened schools and districts, from them being the regulating agency to the Department of Education, shifting the burden onto the tech company.
Now, what about making, that I really like the idea of that $170 million fine, because that'll, leave an impression on somebody. It affects the bottom line. It probably has to be revealed to the board of directors. And it's going to encourage them to encourage the management not to do that again. But query, are our fines stiff enough? Are they consistent? Do they really leave an impression on all those things? If it was up to me, if I was Congress, and I'm a long way from being Congress, I wouldn't run for office for all the tea in China. But I would take some pretty stiff steps. I would not only codify those fines, but I would provide for criminal penalties. I would make the point. I wouldn't want this to happen. You want to enter into a contract and then break it. We're going to have you on that. It's not just a civil matter. So query, is that happening?
It's definitely not being criminalized, but I do think the fines have impact more than just on the pockets, it also has impact on the reputation of and that's worth a lot more to them than 170 million, right? So if you're dealing with a company that works exclusively with schools, and they were built all of their the entire industry that around providing services to schools or school districts. And all of a sudden, there's an article that comes out that they were slapped by a fine by FTC. Now, that affects their reputation, which has capital as well, right? That now the schools are less likely to work with them. They have to work harder to prove that they are reliable. And what happens to those companies? They actually become the most effective protectors of privacy because they revamp their entire agreements and their practices to make sure that privacy is considered by design, not as a side thought, not as a, oh, it's something that we can think of later, right? So it does have an impact to look at it from regulatory standpoint.
No, this is really cutting edge, isn't it? Because on the one hand, we haven't talked about it enough. We have a lot of technology going into education, and the whole COVID, our year of COVID, maybe more now, is a great opportunity to improve education by remote, even education at home, education independent. Even years ago, there was so many programs where you could learn by yourself, and the internet is a perfect example of opportunities to learn by yourself. So it seems to me that we do not want to stand in the way of that. We want our kids to be better educated. And by the way, when I say educated, I mean educated in all things, including civic responsibility and political awareness, which unfortunately we haven't been doing over the past few generations. And we're paying a price for that now. But those educational possibilities, that kind of technology is critical to the future of those generations and our country. And so we want everything we can squeeze out of technology to make it better. And so you're talking about a tension point, a dichotomy between the one consideration and the other, right?
Mhm.
How do you resolve that, at least philosophically?
Actually, I don't think they're on opposite end of the spectrum. I think if you're thoughtfully approach it by designing educational technology that takes privacy into consideration, you set up these guardrails at the beginning so that when you are improving educational opportunities, those safeguards have already been set up. And part of that is policy. I think it's important, but it's not just that. I fully believe a multi-pronged approach when you're looking at cultural shift. And it is a cultural shift because our entire education system has been upended in the way that we learn. So you have to think about it, educating the children about their responsibilities for responsible digital citizenship, what phishing means, what it means to share too much on the internet and the impact it might have, right? So you're starting from that, then you're training teachers and understanding that everything that happens in the classroom, they're possibly sharing information about their students unknowingly doing so, right? And let's say I've had a class where professor required us to create a Twitter account, which I wasn't comfortable doing and really we shouldn't be doing because now our grade depends on creating and giving our information to a private company. So things like that, even though we're familiar with using Twitter and Facebook in our private lives, we have to make a distinction at the school level that those are two separate things that no matter how familiar, comfortable, or the useful that you see Twitter to be, you still have to be thoughtful about what impact it would have on the student.
Well, kids are vulnerable, aren't they?
Yeah.
And presumably, for their youth and lack of life experience, they're more vulnerable than adults. I might question that premise, but for this discussion, let's assume that kids are vulnerable. So we have to, put special attention on protecting them because they could be had. We're not talking necessarily about privacy. We're talking about dealing with the internet, dealing with social media, which would like their information also, dealing with the world that sees them as targets. How do you deal with that?
It does. There are curriculum that are actually being built and taught in schools now from an early age to understand what is internet and how do you function within it and benefit from it without putting yourself at risk. And these are digital citizenship lessons that are happening around the country already. And then what you're seeing, like from my research, I saw that the students understand that um, their privacy is contextual, right? Whatever they're sharing on Facebook, they don't necessarily want the schools to be picking that up or mining that information and using it for them at the university. So they understand there's context to privacy. And that's our shifting understanding of privacy as well, that it's not just all of this is secret and all of this is public. It's more of the information becomes public or private depending on the context.
Yeah, that's why they should all watch this movie.
Okay, I
It'll give them
will.
thrills and chills. That's code bias. But let me ask you one other thing. Now, we spent a half an hour talking about kids and students and teachers, mostly K-12, but maybe college, maybe even graduate school, even that. And the question I put to you is, if we're going to legislate or regulate through the Department of Education and otherwise, we're trying to even the playing field for them, for those kids and students. What about the rest of us? What about the adults who aren't in school? You
Yeah.
said before that they presumably know more about social media. I question that. I think the kids probably know more about social media than they do. But we're all targets. And if we're going to invent policies, if we're going to propagate legislation, either federal or state or a combination, we really don't you think we have to think about adults, not students, also? Because actually, these days, all adults are students too. I learn so much every day from the internet. I know you do too. So the question is, how do you broaden the legislation you have in mind to include the entire community?
Mhm. I actually think, and this goes back to education legislation too, it's not so much more laws, it's better laws. It's better thought out and better designed laws. And then we can learn lessons from other countries and entities like the GDPR. It's been an ongoing process in trying to set up privacy regulations there. But what's happening in this country is our privacy is protected by sector. So your health information is protected by sector because HIPAA has specific regulation for privacy. Your financial information is protected by sector. So there's some parts of your citizenship that is protected. It's just not universally. So designing a law that thinks of what is it that we're trying to protect? Is it our right to control information about ourselves? Which is a different way of thinking of privacy, right? So GDPR incorporates things like right to be forgotten, right to be deleted, and that it's not universal. There's some exceptions to the rule, but overall, they've stipulated that a right to privacy is an inherent human right that it's inalienable. You can't waive it away. So, and the way we think of privacy right now in the United States is something that we can waive our privacy through these terms.
Yeah, you get on the Euclid there and you're waiving everything because you have to click I agree before you can get the software. And they force you into it. No, I totally agree. It should be a right and you can't waive it. And we have to do that. We have to do that. It's really important.
Yeah.
So where are you going with this, Minara? Are you studying it? You're writing about it? You're writing a paper, a book? Are you going to make it your life work? How important is it to you?
It's become increasingly important, and I'm writing a dissertation on this. I began writing it well before COVID started, so it was kind of a fringe issue in education, and then it became a forefront issue during COVID because so much of our environment moved online and privacy became a big issue. So I'm looking at my dissertation is framed in a way where I'm looking at how policies and practices are actually aligned or misaligned. So there's a lot of what I'm seeing is from my research, communication becomes key. Like being able to communicate clearly from top down, bottom up, because student privacy and sharing of student information is happening at every level, right? We are collecting so much data, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like if it wasn't for data, we wouldn't be able to know what is happening at our schools during COVID. We wouldn't know which schools needed laptops. We wouldn't know how many students needed meals, right? All of that is data dependent, and it depends on accurately correcting it, analyzing it properly, and safeguarding it properly. So if we set that up well at the beginning, there's huge benefit from having that information. Um, so this is what I'm exploring, like setting this up, gaining benefit from this innovative technology that we have at our hand, but at the same time thinking ahead of its implications. We don't protect it.
Yeah, thinking wide, thinking national,
Mhm.
or beyond that for that matter.
Yeah.
Minara Mordecai, who is doing very important work, and who I suggest, that work will become more and more important as we go by, and we have to have her back on the show to give us updates about what is going on and how she is protecting not just the students and the kids, but all of us. Thank you, Minara.
Thank you so much, Jay. Thank you.
Aloha.